diversidad de sus culturas, de sus trayectorias históricas extendidas en el tiempo y la singularidad de sus espacios, hacen de México e Israel dos realidades sociales y nacionales que se convocan al diálogo para explorar desafíos y convergencias. Las aspiraciones y rumbos que han seguido para conformar sus identidades y alcanzar su integración nacional, resignificar sus pasados y confrontar los desafíos del presente, han generado pensamientos que expresan una amplia gama de visiones de las más variadas tendencias. En esta sesión, la notable historiadora Anita Shapira de la Universidad de Tel Aviv, galardonada con el Premio Israel, el más importante de ese país, un aplauso por favor. Autora de una profusa obra sobre la historia y la realidad israelí, y la destacada socióloga política Judith Boxer-Liberalt, académica de la UNAM, también destacadísima, y de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén, investigadora de las identidades colectivas y del judaísmo contemporáneo. Ambas abrirán un diálogo para explorar las trayectorias teóricas y las concreciones de estas dos grandes naciones. Un gran honor tenerlas aquí. Mil gracias, las dejo con el micrófono. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a Marisol, muchas gracias por esta cálida bienvenida. A todos ustedes, muchas gracias. Confío que el interés pueda compensar la falta de aire acondicionado, porque si en todas las otras salas sí hay aire acondicionado, corremos el riesgo de que muchos prefieran ir a otra sala. Con este comentario para aligerar nuestra emoción de esta sesión, quiero en primer lugar decirles que el texto que leyó Marisol fue un texto que junto con Robbie Carradian Gordon elaboramos pensando cuál sería el sentido de tener una mesa como la que hoy tenemos. Y debo confesarles que es para mí un absoluto privilegio estar entre historiadores. Hoy, con la historiadora Anita Shapira, lamento profundamente que Enrique Krause haya tenido que irse. Estoy convencida que la historia es madre de las ciencias sociales, que sin la historia corremos el riesgo de tomar distancia y perdernos y alejarnos de la realidad. Pensamos que esta era una oportunidad para poder dialogar cruzando fronteras nacionales y cruzando disciplinas y preguntarnos cuál ha sido, de algún modo, la trayectoria que acompañó tanto en pensamiento como en realizaciones, como en concreciones, al proyecto nacional judío, a la idea de crear y recrear una nación, modernizar un pueblo, fundar un Estado, y cómo eso se relaciona simultáneamente con un punto que a lo largo de esta conversación me interesaría de sobremanera plantearla a Anita, dialogar con ella y plantearlo frente a ustedes. Cómo ese proyecto de la creación de un Estado, un proyecto nacional judío, acompañó también el proyecto de llegada de los inmigrantes a México, integración y construcción de su vida aquí. Quisiera, por tanto, decirles que, conociendo la amplia obra de Anita, donde combina la reconstrucción fundamental de procesos históricos con biografías personales que cruzan las circunstancias y que culminan recientemente con un libro sobre el cual ayer dialogamos, que es Una historia de Israel, un espléndido libro. En ese contexto, yo quisiera pedirle que ella inicie esta sesión, esta reflexión, y que lo haga, a mi entender, desde aquello que realmente nos puede arrojar luz sobre cuál fue este proyecto de renacimiento nacional, cultural, social, económico y político. Anita, quisiera, por tanto, darte la bienvenida y pedirte que inicies tú esta sesión.
Well, thank you very much for the generous presentation. I cannot hear her and myself at the same time in translation. So just excuse me, I have the feeling that I'm talking through a veil today, because I hear the translation through a veil, and then I have to speak in English instead of my mother tongue. So please excuse me if I am less than completely clear in expressing my thoughts. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming, especially considering the weather conditions in this hall. And I think you are very brave and very courageous to stay here. And now let's go to the question. I would start with a saying by one of the Zionist older leaders that claimed that Zionism was Europe's gift to the Jewish people. What does it mean that Zionism was Europe's gift to the Jewish people? Did Europe give us our national movement? In a way, it did. I would say in a positive way and in a negative way. First of all, in a positive way. In the 19th century, we see how the nations of the great empires of the period, the Tsarist Empire, the Habsburgian Empire, the Germans, the Italians, the Czechs, the Poles, the Serbians, all have their own national movements. They have Risorgimento. They have the reawakening of nations. And the Jews sit there and see all these movements, and it cannot be that they were not influenced by the appearance of nations fighting for their freedom. There was a early socialist thinker named Moses Hess, a colleague of Marx, and he wrote a book, Rome and Jerusalem. And what did he claim in this book? He claimed that just like Rome has got to get to be the center of Italian nationalism, of Italian Risorgimento, so should Jerusalem. And until the last national question, the question of the Jews, is solved, there won't be peace in Europe. Why? Because nationalism is like an orchestra. And when one, how do you say it, click? When one instrument is not working, the harmony is lacking. So in order to reach the epics of nationalism in Europe, Jerusalem should become Jewish again. And this he said, he wrote before the beginning of the Zionist movement. So this I would call the positive influence of European nationalism on the Jews. But there was also the negative influence of nationalism on the Jews. And this is what I call the syndrome of the rejected lover. What do I mean by that? As there was a beginning of industrialization, and people started moving from the small villages to the cities, and to get educated, there was a rise in the elites of minor groups. This is how the Czechs got their elite, how the Hungarian got their elite, and so on and so forth. And those elites, as the scholar Ernest Gellner describes, they wanted to assimilate, to integrate into the elite of the leading people. However, the leading people would not incorporate them. They were rejected. So then they said, okay, they don't want us. Let's go back to our own people and have our own national movement. And so this is how the national movements of European people started. Now, the same thing happened to the Jews. The Jewish elite got assimilated, got integrated into the European states in which they lived, but they were not accepted. They were rejected. So this is the syndrome of the rejected lover. Instead of being the part of the leading elite in those nations, we will be the elite of the rising Jewish people. Now, this means that we talk about a movement of intellectuals, a very, very thin stratum among the people. They were those who wrote the polemics. They were those who wrote the novels. They were those who wrote the poems that inspired people. But they were a very small minority. And this is true about every national movement. All national movements start with a dedicated but small movement, very small minority. Now, at that period, usually the movement is primarily a cultural one. And the question is, how does a small movement become a mass movement? How does a small movement become the leader of the people? And this process is the center of what I call the empowerment of the individual. Because how does nationalism work? In order to be a member of a national movement, you have to believe that you are capable of changing your own destiny. Not only your own destiny, the destiny of the whole collective, which means that the individual is powerful. The individual is free from religion, from the, I would say, from the belief that you have to wait for the providence to help you change your fate. And in this regard, I connect with what Judy said before. Because if we look at the movements of immigration, it is the same idea. The individual decided that it's time for him to take his destiny in his own hand and change it by moving to another country, by organizing a new collective, by working for the sake of world revolution, which means there are various avenues to bring about this change, the empowerment of the individual. But all these trends lead to one direction, the change of reality for the betterment of the future. And here we have the conjunction between nationalism and the destiny of the individual. And maybe we'll talk about it a little later.
Bien, creo que coincidimos cabalmente. Se trata aquí de un movimiento que nace en el contexto europeo. Repito, se trata de un movimiento que nace en el contexto europeo, que se encuentra con puertas que se abren y puertas que se cierran, con aceptación dentro de los cambios que se dan en el siglo XIX y simultáneamente un rechazo por los propios movimientos nacionalistas. En ese contexto y como proyecto, por una parte se trata de un renacimiento cultural. Creo que tu referencia, Anita, a las élites que van produciendo un nuevo diagnóstico de la realidad. Lo que existía parecía insuficiente, sea en el Imperio zarista y aún en toda la Europa oriental. Los diagnósticos ante el deterioro de la condición judía parecen insuficientes. Y junto con, por eso creo que no es casual cuando señalas un movimiento migratorio como una decisión individual, junto con eso se incrementa la necesidad de abandonar ese continente y esas tierras. Entonces emerge por una parte la necesidad de emigrar y por la otra nuevas ideologías y movimientos que disputan entre sí el preguntar hacia dónde hacerlo. Y me parece que es muy adecuado lo que tú señalas de que se trata de un movimiento que fue minoritario y que en esa perspectiva se debate con otras ideologías, internamente se diversifica, hay muchas corrientes. Y aquí me parece que habría un punto que yo quisiera todavía oírte más y voy a hacerlo como pregunta. Por una parte está la necesidad de emigrar y por la otra la respuesta hacia dónde emigrar. La emigración individual cruza el océano y va a aquellos lugares donde es aceptada. Pero inicialmente el proyecto de emigración a la nueva tierra que va, la tierra ancestral, la tierra prometida, pero la nueva tierra siempre tiene un carácter colectivo, como una solución colectiva. No un fenómeno de agregado de individuos, sino una recomposición de una nueva identidad. Y entonces aquí viene para mí una pregunta muy concreta. ¿Cómo conviven en el seno de este proyecto de construir una nueva sociedad, pero también de construir una nueva identidad judía en la modernidad? ¿Cómo convive la creación del centro judío renacido, recreado, y la afirmación de que la diáspora existe y habrá de continuar? Como si hubiese una elaboración que dice, en efecto, va a ser una solución que va a acoger a todo el pueblo, y por otra parte, el saber que no va a acoger a todo ese pueblo, pero para que ese pueblo continúe existiendo, necesita un Estado. Quisiera oírte en torno a esto.
I'm not sure that I understood it, but let me try to answer it in my own language, in my own terms. Let me put it like that. As I said before, the question of turning a movement of small minorities into a mass movement is a very crucial one. Now, what we had with the Zionist movement was something exceptional. It was a transnational movement. It was a movement that started actually in Central Europe, and I'll immediately explain, but its masses, its support, came from the masses from Eastern Europe. And here it's a very interesting combination, because let's take the prophet of Zionism, Herzl, the first leader, the Messiah, I would say, the king of the Jews, as he was called. Herzl was a journalist who one day rose in the morning and said, like the poem by Amichai, a man gets up in the morning and starts walking and decides that he is a people. And this is what happened with Herzl. Suddenly, this man that liked coffee shops and to dress well and to write plays, very second-rate plays, suddenly he became a prophet, and he writes this little contrast, this little pamphlet called The Jewish State, and in which he says the Jews who would want it will have their state. And this is, you know, something like what Ernst Renan, the French philosopher, said, that nationalism is a daily plebiscite. Namely, it's a question of individual attachment to the idea. If people are attached to the idea, they have their nationalism. If they decide we don't need it, they won't have it. Now, just in an aside, in Tel Aviv there is this graffiti with the image of Herzl, and underneath it's written, if you don't want, you don't need. But let's go back to earlier times. Now, Herzl was an Austrian Jew, and his first followers came from the German-speaking countries, the Jewish German-speaking countries. Now, the people whose message caught their heart were the people of Eastern Europe. There were the millions of Jews downtrodden, despised, discriminated against, and they looked at him as if he was the Messiah. When he came to Vilnius, and the crowds came to visit him, to meet him at the train station, there were millions of people there. And this was the feeling that this was the merging of the leadership with the people. But most of the people, though in their heart they craved for the Jewish land, for the Holy Land, they went to America. The millions went to America. Only a small trickle took the journey to the Middle East. Palestine was at that time a backward country, a country with no facilities, with no economic resources. A family looking for livelihood would not go there. What would they seek there? So only a small minority went there. And even from this small minority, 90% left the country. But those 10% that stayed, I would like to devote a few words to them, because they were the mitigating stratum between the elite and the masses. And they carried on their shoulders the Zionist movement in those periods before it became a majority movement. What do I mean by that? I mean by that a small minority of middle-class Jews, lower middle-class Jews, who came from Russia. Why lower middle class?